The air in Willow Creek, Ohio, always carried a faint chill in early October, even when the sun was high. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew each other's business, where the biggest event of the year was the annual Harvest Festival, and where garage sales were a Saturday ritual. I'd lived here my whole life, and after my wife passed 3 years ago, it became just me and my daughter Abby. She was 8 now, with her mother's bright green eyes and a laugh that could melt the coldest heart. But lately, that laugh had been harder to come by. Abby had been quiet since the summer, clinging to her stuffed animals like they were her only friends. I thought a new toy might cheer her up. That Saturday morning, I bundled Abby into her favorite blue jacket, and we walked down Maple Street to Mrs. Harrow's garage sale. The old woman had lived in Willow Creek longer than anyone could remember. Her house a crumbling relic at the edge of town. Her yard was cluttered with the usual junk-rusted garden tools, chipped teacups, a box of faded romance novels, but Abby's eyes lit up when she spotted a porcelain doll sitting on a folding table. The doll was striking, to say the least. She was about 2 feet tall, dressed in a pristine white lace gown that looked like it belonged in a museum. Her hair was a cascade of golden curls, tied with a red ribbon, and her face was eerily perfect smooth porcelain with rosy cheeks and lips painted a delicate pink. But it was her eyes that caught me off guard. They were a piercing blue, so vivid they seemed to shimmer in the morning light, almost as if they were watching me. A small tag tied to her wrist read, "Miriam." Abby's voice was the brightest I'd heard in weeks as she squealed with delight, pointing at the doll and exclaiming how pretty she was, how she wanted to take her home. I couldn't help but smile at her excitement, though I felt a strange unease as I crouched down to get a better look. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, a trick of the light, I told myself, but there was something unsettling about her, something I couldn't quite place. Mrs. Harrow shuffled over, her cane tapping against the pavement. She was a frail woman, her face a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp, like she could see right through you. She glanced at the doll, then at Abby, and her expression darkened. In a raspy voice, she warned that the doll was special, that it had belonged to a dollmaker named Edmund Crow who lived here back in the 50s. A strange man, she said, who made dolls so lifelike that folks claimed they could almost talk. I forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, and asked how much the doll cost. $5, she replied, but her tone grew heavier as she added a caution to be careful with her, that she had a way of getting attached. I handed over the money, ignoring the warning. It was just a doll after all, a toy to make my daughter smile. What harm could it do? We walked home, Abby clutching Miriam to her chest like she'd found a long-lost friend. She chatted the whole way, her voice bubbling with excitement as she described the tea party she'd have with Miriam, how she'd dress her up, how she'd sleep with her every night. I nodded along, happy to see her so excited, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those blue eyes were still watching me, even as we stepped through our front door. That night, after I tucked Abby into bed, I sat in the living room with a cup of coffee, trying to focus on the TV. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling. Abby's room was just down the hall, her door slightly ajar, so I could hear if she needed me. She'd fallen asleep with Miriam in her arms, the doll's golden curls spilling over the pillow. I was halfway through an episode of some mindless sitcom when I heard a soft murmur coming from Abby's room. At first, I thought she was talking in her sleep. She did that sometimes, mumbling about her dreams. But then I heard another sound, a low and raspy whisper, like someone speaking through a crack in the wall. The words were faint, but I could make them out. Abby's sleepy voice asking if Miriam liked her room, followed by a chilling response in a voice that wasn't hers, a voice that said it loved the room, that it was so glad Abby was its own. My coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. That second voice, it wasn't Abby's. It wasn't any voice I'd ever heard. It was wrong. I stood, my legs shaky, and crept down the hall, pushing Abby's door open. She was asleep, her chest rising and falling steadily, her arms wrapped around Miriam. The doll's blue eyes glinted in the moonlight streaming through the window, and for a moment I could have sworn they moved, locking onto mine. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. It was late. I was tired. Grief did strange things to the mind. I'd read that somewhere. I closed the door and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache, the kind that felt like a hammer against my skull. The events of the previous night lingered in my mind like a bad dream, the shattered coffee cup, the strange whisper from Abby's room, the way Miriam's blue eyes seemed to follow me in the moonlight. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. I hadn't been sleeping well since my wife passed, and the stress of raising Abby on my own was taking its toll. That had to be it. I couldn't let myself think otherwise. I shuffled into the kitchen to make breakfast, the early morning light filtering through the curtains in soft, golden streaks. Abby was still asleep, or so I thought, her door still closed down the hall. I reached for the coffee pot, hoping a strong cup would clear the fog in my head, when I froze. There, on the kitchen table, sat Miriam. The doll's porcelain face was turned toward me, her blue eyes glinting in the sunlight, her golden curls spilling over the edge of the table. Her white lace dress was pristine, not a speck of dust on it, and her painted lips seemed to curve into the faintest smile. My stomach dropped. I hadn't brought the doll out here. I'd left her in Abby's room, tucked under the covers with her. I was sure of it. I stood there, staring at Miriam, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe Abby had woken up early and brought her out here before going back to sleep. That had to be it. But the house was silent, and Abby wasn't the type to wake up before me. She loved her sleep as much as I loved my coffee. I called out softly, my voice barely above a whisper, asking if Abby was awake. There was no answer, just the faint creak of the house settling. I stepped closer to the table, my hands trembling as I reached for the doll. Her porcelain skin was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, even in the chilly morning air. I picked her up, her weight heavier than I remembered, and carried her back to Abby's room, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. Abby was still asleep, her small form curled under the blankets, her breathing steady. I placed Miriam back on the bed beside her, tucking the doll under the covers where she'd been the night before. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor, tiny smudges of dirt, no bigger than a child's footprint, leading from the door to the bed. My heart skipped a beat. Abby's feet were clean when I tucked her in, and she hadn't been outside since we got home from the garage sale. I knelt down, running my finger over one of the smudges. It was real, gritty and damp, like someone had walked through mud and tracked it inside. I stood up, my mind racing. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I'd tracked the dirt in myself last night and hadn't noticed. Maybe the doll had been dirty when we bought her, and I'd somehow missed it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The doll was spotless, her white dress as pristine as ever. I glanced at Miriam again, and for a moment I could have sworn her head had tilted slightly, her blue eyes now angled toward me instead of the ceiling. I blinked, and she was back to normal, her gaze fixed straight ahead. A trick of the light, I told myself, but my hands were shaking as I left the room. Abby woke up an hour later, her footsteps pattering down the hall as she came into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She was still in her pajamas, her dark hair a tangled mess, but her face lit up when she saw the plate of pancakes I'd made. I tried to act normal, pouring syrup over her breakfast and asking if she'd slept well. Her voice was bright and cheerful as she nodded, saying she'd had the best dreams, that Miriam had told her stories all night, I forced a smile, but my stomach twisted at her words. I asked what kind of stories, trying to keep my tone light, but Abby's expression changed, her green eyes growing distant. She said Miriam told her about a big house with lots of toys, where children played forever and never had to grow up. But the house was dark, she added, her voice dropping to a whisper, and there was a man there who watched them, a man with no face. I froze, the syrup bottle slipping from my hand and clattering onto the counter. I asked if she meant a dream, if she'd imagined it, but Abby shook her head, her voice firm as she insisted that Miriam had told her that the doll had whispered to her while she slept. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe she was just making it up, that her imagination was running wild like any child's would with a new toy. But the memory of that raspy voice from the night before the one that had said it was glad Abby was its own echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I told Abby to eat her pancakes, promising we'd play with Miriam later, but my appetite was gone. I needed answers. After breakfast, Abby ran off to her room to get dressed, her laughter echoing down the hall as she called out to Miriam, saying they'd have a tea party today. I waited until I heard her door close, then grabbed my laptop and sat at the kitchen table, my fingers trembling as I typed Edmund Crowe Dollmaker Willow Creek into the search bar. Mrs. Harrow's words from the garage sale replayed in my head that the doll had belonged to a strange man who made dolls so lifelike. Folks said they could almost talk. I needed to know who this Edmund Crowe was, and why his doll was giving me the creeps. The search results loaded slowly, the internet in Willow Creek as sluggish as ever, but what came up made my blood run cold. There were old newspaper articles, grainy black and white photos, and a few blog posts from local historians. Edmund Crowe had been a dollmaker in Willow Creek during the 1950s, known for his craftsmanship but also for his reclusive nature. He lived in a large house on the outskirts of town, a place the locals called Crow's Nest, where he spent his days crafting dolls that were so detailed they looked almost human. But in 1956, Crow's name became infamous for a much darker reason. Several children in Willow Creek had gone missing that year, all within a few months of each other. The disappearances were never solved, but suspicion quickly fell on Crowe. Neighbors reported seeing children playing in his yard, only to never see them again. One article mentioned a mother who claimed she'd seen her missing son's face in one of Crowe's dolls. The porcelain features an exact replica of her child's. The police searched Crowe's house, but they found nothing, no children. No evidence, just hundreds of dolls lining the shelves, their glass eyes staring blankly at the officers. Crowe was never charged, but the town turned against him, and he died a year later, alone in his house, under what the coroner called mysterious circumstances. I scrolled further, my heart pounding, until I found a photo of Crowe. He was a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and dark, sunken eyes, his expression cold and unreadable. In his lap sat a dollar porcelain doll with golden curls and a white lace dress, her blue eyes staring straight at the camera. It was Miriam. There was no mistaking her. The caption beneath the photo read, Edmund Crowe with his final creation. Miriam, named after his daughter who passed away in 1955. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the edge of the table. Miriam had been Crowe's last doll, made in memory of his daughter. That explained the name, but it didn't explain the whispers, the muddy footprints, or the way the doll had moved from Abby's room to the kitchen. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be a logical explanation, but the unease in my chest was growing, a heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. I decided to check on Abby, needing to see her, to make sure she was okay. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house, and pushed open her door. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by her crayons and a stack of paper, drawing with a focus I'd never seen before. Miriam sat beside her, propped up against the bed, her blue eyes fixed on Abby's work. I asked what she was drawing, trying to keep my voice steady, but Abby didn't look up. She said it was a picture of her and Miriam, her voice soft and distant, like she was in a trance. I knelt beside her, my heart sinking as I looked at the drawing. It showed two figures holding hands, a little girl with dark hair and a doll with golden curls. But behind them was a third figure, tall and shadowy, with no face, just a blank oval where its features should have been. The figure's hand rested on Abby's shoulder, its fingers long and claw-like, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I asked who the shadow was, my voice barely above a whisper, and Abby's Korean paused mid-stroke. She said it was the man from the big house, the one Miriam told her about, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear her. The man who watched the children play, she added. The man who never let them leave. I took the drawing from her, my hands trembling, and told her to go play outside for a while, that I needed to clean up her room. She nodded, her expression blank, and ran off to the backyard, leaving me alone with Miriam. I picked up the doll, her porcelain skin cold against my hands, and stared into her blue eyes. They seemed darker now, the blue deeper, almost black, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move behind them. A flicker of shadow that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I set her down on the bed, my mind racing. I needed to know more about Edmund Crowe, about what he'd done to those children, and about what he'd done to this doll. I spent the rest of the morning digging through more articles, piecing together the story of Crowe's life and death. One blog post mentioned a rumor that had circulated after his death that Crowe had been obsessed with bringing his daughter back, that he'd turned to dark rituals to preserve her soul in the doll he named after her. The post claimed that Miriam was more than just a toy, that she was a vessel, a container for something unnatural, something that hungered for more. I didn't believe in the supernatural, not really, but the muddy footprints, the whispers, and Abby's drawing were making it hard to stay rational. That afternoon, I decided to take Miriam out of the house. I couldn't stand the thought of her being near Abby any longer. I wrapped the doll in an old blanket, her blue eyes staring up at me as I carried her to the car and drove to a dumpster. A few blocks away, I threw her in, the sound of her porcelain body hitting the metal echoing in the quiet street, and drove home, telling myself it was over. Abby would be upset, but I'd buy her a new doll, something bright and cheerful, something that didn't make my skin crawl. But when I got home, Abby was sitting on the living room floor, her back to me. She was humming softly, a tune I didn't recognize, and in her lap sat Miriam. The doll's white dress was spotless, her golden curls perfectly in place, her blue eyes fixed on me as I walked through the door. My knees buckled, and I had to grab the wall to keep from falling. I asked Abby how the doll got back, my voice shaking, and she turned to me, her green eyes wide and innocent. She said Miriam didn't want to leave, that she'd come back because she loved her. Her voice so calm, it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, the lights on, a baseball but resting on the couch beside me. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move in the corner of my eye. I kept picturing those muddy footprints, the drawing of the faceless man, the way Miriam's eyes seemed to follow me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain: Miriam wasn't just a doll, and whatever she wasn't going to let us go. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and growing dread. I couldn't get the image of Miriam out of my head, her blue eyes staring at me from the living room floor, her golden curls untouched by the dirt of the dumpster I'd thrown her into. The way she'd returned, as if she'd walked back into the house on her own, was impossible to rationalize. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, that someone had found her and brought her back, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. No one in Willow Creek would have gone to that kind of trouble, and the way Abby had looked at me, her green eyes wide and innocent, as she explained that Miriam didn't want to leave sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. I kept the doll out of Abby's room after that, locking her in a closet in the basement. I didn't tell Abby where I'd put her, just that Miriam needed a time out for a while. Abby's face fell, her lower lip trembling as she begged to have her friend back, her voice rising into a whine that broke my heart. I hated seeing her so upset, but I couldn't let her near that thing. Not after what I'd seen, not after what I'd heard. I promised her we'd get a new doll, something bright and cheerful, but she shook her head, her voice small and stubborn as she insisted that Miriam was her best friend, that she didn't want anyone else. I tried to distract her with other things, baking cookies, watching her favorite cartoons, taking her to the park, but she was different now. The spark in her eyes, the one that had always reminded me of her mother, was fading. She moved slower, her laughter quieter, her smiles forced. She'd sit for hours in her room, staring at the wall where she'd last seen Miriam, her crayons untouched, her toys ignored. I asked her what was wrong, my voice gentle as I sat beside her on the floor, but she wouldn't look at me. She said she missed Miriam, that she could hear her crying at night, her voice so soft I had to lean in to hear her. I told her it was just a dream, that dolls couldn't cry, but the look in her eyes told me she didn't believe me. I started hearing things too. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd hear faint sounds coming from the basement, a soft tapping, like tiny porcelain fingers against the closet door, or a low, raspy hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I told myself it was the pipes, the old house settling, anything but what I feared it might be. But the sounds grew louder each night, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding, as I listened to the tapping, the humming, the occasional whisper that sounded like my name. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every shadow, second-guessing every sound. I needed to know what I was dealing with, what Edmund Crowe had done to that doll, and why it was affecting my daughter. I went back to my laptop, diving deeper into the history of Crowe and his creations, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. I found a forum post from a local historian, someone who'd spent years researching Willow Creek's past, and what I read made my blood run cold. The post claimed that Edmund Crowe hadn't just been a dollmaker, he'd been obsessed with the occult. After his daughter, Miriam, died of tuberculosis in 1955, Crowe had spiraled into madness, convinced he could bring her back. He turned to dark rituals, the kind that involved blood and symbols and things no sane person would touch. The historian wrote that Crowe believed he could trap souls in his dolls, preserving them forever, and that he'd use the children who went missing in Willow Creek as test subjects, trying to perfect the ritual before using it on his daughter's soul. But something had gone wrong with his final creation, the doll named Miriam. The ritual had worked, but not in the way he'd intended. Instead of bringing his daughter back, he'd trapped something else inside the doll, something hungry, something that craved more souls to feed its endless appetite. I sat back in my chair, my hands trembling as I read the words again. A vessel for something unnatural, the historian had called it. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit together, the whispers, the muddy footprints, the way Miriam kept coming back. I thought about Abby's drawing, the faceless man standing behind her and the doll, and a new wave of fear washed over me. Was that what was inside Miriam? Was that what was watching my daughter, whispering to her in the night? I needed more than forum posts and rumors. I needed proof, something concrete. I remembered the house where Crowe had lived, the one the locals called Crow's Nest. It was still standing, though it had been abandoned for decades, a crumbling relic on the outskirts of town. If there were answers to be found, they'd be there. I decided to go that afternoon, while Abby was at a playdate with a neighbor's kid. I didn't want her anywhere near that place, Not after what I'd read. I drove out to Crow's Nest, the old house looming at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by overgrown weeds and gnarled trees. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeling in long, jagged strips, and the air around it felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I parked the car and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, my hands slick with sweat as I approached the front door. It was unlocked, the wood warped and splintered, and it creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty halls. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew and decay clinging to everything. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and every step sent a cloud of dust swirling into the air. The house was a maze of narrow hallways and small rooms, each one filled with the remnants of Crow's life, rusted tools, broken furniture, and shelves lined with dolls. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their glass eyes staring blankly at me as I passed. Some were missing limbs, others had cracked faces, but all of them had that same eerie lifelike quality as Miriam. Their expressions frozen in a mix of innocence and something darker. I found what I assumed was Crow's workshop in the back of the house, a large room with a workbench covered in tools and scraps of fabric. There were sketches pinned to the walls, detailed drawings of dolls with notes scrawled in the margins, measurements, paint colors, and strange symbols I didn't recognize. But what caught my eye was a small wooden box on the workbench, its lid carved with the same symbols from the sketches. I opened it, my hands trembling, and inside I found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The journal belonged to Crow, his handwriting a jagged scrawl that was hard to read in the dim light. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding as I scanned the entries. Most of them were about his daughter, Miriam, how much he missed her, how he couldn't bear to live without her, how he'd do anything to bring her back. But as the entries went on, they grew darker, more unhinged. He wrote about the rituals he'd found in an old book, rituals that promised to bind a soul to an object, to keep it in this world forever. He described the children he'd taken, how he'd used their souls to test the ritual, how he'd carved their names into the doors to hold them. But each attempt had failed, the souls slipping away, leaving the dolls empty. The final entry was dated the day before his death, and it was the most chilling of all. Crow wrote that he'd finally succeeded, that he'd bound his daughter's soul to the doll he'd named after her. But something had gone wrong, he said, his handwriting shaky and uneven. The ritual had opened a door to something else, something that had taken his daughter's place inside the doll. He called it a hunger, a thing that craved more, that whispered to him in the night, demanding more souls to feed its endless appetite. He wrote that he'd tried to destroy the doll, to break the ritual, but it wouldn't let him. The last line of the entry was a single sentence, scrawled in a frantic hand. "It knows my name, and it won't let me go." I closed the journal, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Everything I'd feared was true. Miriam wasn't just a doll, she was a vessel, a container for something dark, something that had been feeding on souls for decades, and now it was in my house, with my daughter. I thought about Abby, about the way she'd been acting, the way her eyes had grown distant, her laughter fading. Was it already too late? Was the thing inside Miriam already taking her? I stuffed the journal into my jacket and left the house, the weight of what I'd learned pressing down on me like a physical force. I drove home faster than I should have, my mind racing with what to do next. I needed to get rid of the doll, for good, this time, but I didn't know how. Crow had tried to destroy her, and it hadn't worked. What chance did I have? When I got home, Abby was back from her playdate, sitting on the living room floor with her crayons. She looked up at me, her green eyes dull, her skin paler than I'd ever seen it. She said she'd heard Miriam crying again, that she'd heard her through the basement door, her voice small and trembling. I knelt beside her, my heart breaking at the sight of her, and asked if she was okay. She nodded, but her expression was blank, her movements slow and mechanical, like a puppet on strings. She said Miriam was sad, that she wanted to play, that she wanted Abby to be her friend forever. I told her to stay in the living room, that I'd be right back, and went down to the basement, my flashlight in hand. The air was colder down there, the darkness thicker, and the tapping sound I'd heard at night was louder now, more insistent. I approached the closet, my hand shaking as I turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, and there was Miriam, sitting on the floor where I'd left her, her blue eyes glinting in the beam of my flashlight. But something was different. Her head was tilted to the side, her painted lips curved into a wider smile than before, and in her lap was a piece of paper drawing, just like the one Abby had made, but this one was worse. It showed Abby and Miriam holding hands, the faceless man standing behind them, but now the man's hand was wrapped around Abby's throat, his claw-like fingers digging into her skin. I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the floor as I stumbled back. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy hum that seemed to come from the doll itself. The hum grew louder, forming words, a whisper that echoed in the darkness, words that said Abby would be its own, that I couldn't stop it, that it would take her forever. I slammed the closet door shut, my hands trembling as I turned the key, but the humming didn't stop. It followed me up the stairs, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls, through my bones, a sound that wouldn't let me go. I stumbled up the basement stairs, the raspy hum of Miriam's voice echoing in my ears, the words it had whispered about taking Abby forever repeating over and over in my mind. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I locked the basement door behind me, the click of the deadbolt doing little to ease the panic clawing at my chest. The drawing I'd found in the closet, the one with the faceless man's claws around Abby's throat, was still in my hand, crumpled from how tightly I'd been gripping it. I smoothed it out on the kitchen table, staring at the jagged lines, the shadowy figure. The way Miriam's painted smile seemed to mark me even in crayon. Abby was still in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her crayon scattered around her. She was drawing again, her movements slow and deliberate, her head tilted as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. I called her name, my voice trembling, and she looked up at me, her green eyes dull and lifeless, her skin so pale it was almost translucent. She said she could hear Miriam singing, that the song was coming from the basement, her voice soft and distant, like she was speaking from a dream. I told her to stop drawing, to come sit with me in the kitchen, but she shook her head, her voice growing sharper as she insisted that Miriam needed her, that she had to finish the picture. I knelt beside her, my hands shaking as I looked at her new drawing. It was worse than the last one. This time, it showed only two figures, Abby and the faceless man. Miriam was gone, but the man's claws were wrapped around Abby's wrists, pulling her toward a dark, jagged shape that looked like a hole in the ground. Abby's face in the drawing was blank, her eyes empty, and the man's faceless head was tilted toward her, as if he were whispering something. I asked what the picture meant, my voice barely above a whisper, and Abby's crayon paused mid-stroke. She said the man was taking her to the big house, the one Miriam told her about, her voice so calm it sent a shiver down my spine. She said it was a place where children played forever, but they couldn't leave, and the man made sure they stayed. I tore the drawing in half, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the paper. I told Abby to go to her room, that I needed to take care of something, my voice sharper than I'd intended. She didn't argue, just stood and walked down the hall, her movements stiff and mechanical, like a doll on strings. I waited until I heard her door close, then grabbed my phone and called Mrs. Harrow, the woman who'd sold me the doll. I needed to know more, anything that might help me stop whatever was happening to my daughter. Mrs. Harrow answered on the third ring, her voice raspy and tired. like she'd been expecting my call. I didn't waste time with pleasantries, my words tumbling out in a rush as I explained what had been happening: the whispers, the muddy footprints, the way Miriam kept coming back, the drawings, the changes in Abby. I told her about the journal I'd found at Crow's house, about the ritual, about the thing inside the doll. I asked if she knew anything, if there was a way to stop it, my voice breaking as I pleaded for help. Her voice was heavy with regret as she admitted that she'd known the doll was trouble, that she'd hoped it wouldn't cause any harm, that she'd only sold it because she couldn't stand having it in her house anymore. She said her own mother had bought Miriam at an estate sale after Crow's death, that she'd heard the whispers too, that she'd seen things move in the night. She said she'd tried to destroy the doll once, years ago, but it had come back, just like it had for me. Her voice trembling as she described the way its blue eyes had stared at her, unblinking from the ashes of the fire she'd thrown it into. I asked if there was a way to stop it, my voice desperate, and she hesitated, her breathing ragged on the other end of the line. She said there might be a way, something her mother had told her before she passed, her voice dropping to a whisper as she explained. She said the doll was bound to the soul it had taken, that it needed a new soul to replace the one it held, that it would keep taking until it was satisfied. But there was a ritual, she added, one that could break the cycle, one that Crow had written about in his journal. She said I'd need to find the doll's anchor, the thing that tied it to this world, and destroy it, her voice firm as she warned that it wouldn't be easy, that the doll would fight to protect itself. I thanked her, my mind racing as I hung up the phone. I went back to the journal, flipping through the pages with renewed urgency, searching for anything about an anchor. I found it near the end, a passage written in a shaky hand, the ink smudged as if Crow had been crying as he wrote. He described the anchor as a piece of his daughter, something that held her essence, something he'd used to bind her soul to the doll. He said it was hidden where no one would find it, where the earth would keep it safe, his words cryptic and vague. I read the passage again, my heart sinking as I realized what he meant. The anchor was buried, somewhere in Willow Creek, somewhere tied to his daughter's memory. I thought about Crow's house, about the land around it, about the old cemetery on the edge of town where the locals said he'd buried his daughter. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. I needed to find that anchor, to destroy it, to save Abby before it was too late. I glanced at the basement door, the hum still vibrating through the walls, and knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to act now, before the thing inside Miriam took my daughter for good. I left Abby with the neighbor, telling her I'd be back soon, that I had an errand to run. She didn't ask questions, just nodded and took Abby's hand, her eyes full of concern as she noticed how pale my daughter looked, how her movements were slow and mechanical. I didn't have time to explain, didn't have the words to describe the nightmare I was living. I grabbed a shovel from the garage, the journal tucked into my jacket, and drove to the old cemetery on the edge of Willow Creek, the one where Edmund, Crow's daughter, was buried. The cemetery was small, a forgotten patch of land surrounded by gnarled trees, the headstones weathered and cracked with age. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting long shadows across the graves, their air thick, with the scent of damp earth and decay. I found Miriam Crow's grave near the back, a small headstone with her name carved in faded letters, the dates 1948 to 1955 barely legible. I knelt beside it, my hands trembling as I started to dig, the shovel biting into the soft earth with a dull thud. The ground was harder than I'd expected, the dirt packed tight from years of neglect, but I kept digging, my muscles burning as I worked. I didn't know what I was looking for, didn't know what the anchor might be, but I had to find it. I thought about Abby, about the way her eyes had dulled, about the drawings, about the faceless man who wanted to take her to a place she'd never leave. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. I dug for what felt like hours, the hole growing deeper, the dirt piling up beside me. My flashlight flickered, the battery dying as the last light of day faded, leaving me in near darkness. I was about to give up, my body aching. My hands blistered when the shovel hit something hard, a small wooden box, its surface carved with the same symbols I'd seen in Crow's journal. I pulled it from the earth, my hands shaking as I brushed the dirt from its lid. It was locked, a rusted padlock holding it shut, but I didn't have time to find a key. I smashed it against a nearby headstone, the wood splintering with a crack that echoed through the cemetery. Inside the box was a small porcelain heart, no bigger than a child's fist, its surface painted with delicate red roses. It was beautiful, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. The heart felt warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been, and I could have sworn I felt it pulse, a faint rhythm that matched the beating of my own heart. I knew this was the anchor, the thing that tied Miriam's soul to the doll, the thing that had let something else take her place. I had to destroy it. I set the heart on the ground, raising the shovel to smash it, but before I could bring it down, I heard a sound, a low, raspy hum, the same hum I'd heard in the basement. It was coming from the box, from the heart, growing louder with each passing second. The hum formed words, a whisper that sent a chill down my spine, words that said I couldn't stop it, that Abby was already its own, that I was too late. I froze, the shovel trembling in my hands, as the air around me grew colder, the shadows in the cemetery stretching and twisting, taking on shapes that weren't human. I looked around, my heart pounding, and saw them figures in the darkness, small and pale, their eyes black and empty. They were children, or what was left of them, their faces gaunt, their clothes tattered and stained with dirt. They moved toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural, their mouths open in silent screams. I recognized one of them from the newspaper articles. I'd read a boy who'd gone missing in 1956. His face an exact match for the photo I'd seen. They were the children Crow had taken, the ones he'd used in his rituals, the ones whose souls had been trapped in his dolls. The children closed in, their hands reaching for me, their fingers cold and claw-like against my skin. I dropped the shovel, stumbling back, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I clutched the porcelain heart to my chest. The hum grew louder, the whisper turning into a scream, a sound that filled the cemetery, that filled my head, that made my vision blur. I fell to my knees, the heart slipping from my hands, and as it hit the ground, it shattered, the pieces scattering across the dirt. The scream stopped, the silence that followed so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The children froze, their black eyes fixed on the broken heart, and then they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness like smoke. I sat there, my hands pressed into the dirt, my body trembling as I tried to catch my breath. The air was warmer now, the shadows still, but I knew it wasn't over. The heart was destroyed, but Miriam was still in my house, still with Abby. I had to get back, had to make sure she was safe. I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The journal still tucked into my jacket. The streets of Willow Creek were empty, the town asleep under a moonless sky. But the silence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. I pulled into the driveway, my heart sinking as I saw the front door wide open, the lights inside flickering. I called Abby's name as I ran into the house, my voice echoing in the empty rooms, but there was no answer. I ran through the house, my voice hoarse as I called Abby's name, the flickering lights casting jagged shadows on the walls. The air was thick with a cold that seeped into my bones, the kind of cold that didn't come from an October night. In Ohio, every room I checked was empty, her bedroom, the kitchen, the bathroom all silent, all untouched. The basement door was still locked, the deadbolt in place, but the hum I'd heard earlier was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier, more oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. I found her in the living room, sitting on the floor in front of the couch, her back to me. She was still, her head tilted slightly to the side, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders. In her lap sat Miriam, the doll's blue eyes glinting in the dim light, her porcelain face turned toward me as if she'd been waiting for my return. My heart stopped, my breath catching in my throat as I took a step closer, my hands trembling at my sides. I called Abby's name again, my voice barely above a whisper, but she didn't move, didn't turn, didn't answer. I knelt beside her, my knees sinking into the carpet, and reached out to touch her shoulder. Her skin was cold, colder than it should have been, and when I turned her to face me, I nearly screamed. Her eyes, those bright green eyes that had always reminded me of her mother, were gone, replaced by a deep, unnatural blue, the same blue as Miriam's. Her face was pale, her lips parted in a faint smile, and her expression was blank, like a doll's, like she was no longer my Abby, but something else entirely. I shook her, my hands gripping her shoulders, my voice breaking as I begged her to wake up, to look at me, to say something. But she didn't respond, her body limp in my arms, her blue eyes staring through me, unseeing. I turned to Miriam, the doll still sitting in her lap, and saw that her painted smile had widened. Her porcelain lips curved into a grin that was almost human, almost alive. The air around her seemed to shimmer, a faint distortion that made my vision blur, and I heard the hum again, low and raspy, coming from the doll itself. The hum grew louder, forming words, a whisper that filled the room, that filled my head, a voice that said I was too late, that Abby belonged to it now, that she would play forever in the big house with the other children. I screamed, my voice raw, and grabbed the doll, my hands shaking as I threw her across the room. She hit the wall with a crack, her porcelain arm shattering into pieces, but the hum didn't stop, the whisper didn't fade. It grew louder, more insistent, and I saw the pieces of her arm begin to move, crawling back toward her body like they were alive, like they were trying to put themselves back together. I turned back to Abby, my hands cupping her face, my tears falling onto her pale cheeks as I begged her to come back to me. But her blue eyes didn't change, her smile didn't falter, and I knew, deep down, that I'd lost her. The thing inside Miriam had taken her, just as it had taken the children in 1956, just as it had taken Crow's daughter all those years ago. I thought about the porcelain heart I'd destroyed in the cemetery, the way the ghostly children had faded, and realized that breaking the anchor hadn't been enough. The ritual had been too strong, the thing inside the doll too powerful, and I'd been too late to stop it. I picked up Abby, her body light in my arms, and carried her to the couch, laying her down gently, my hands trembling as I brushed her hair from her face. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix this, didn't know if I even could. I turned to Miriam, the doll now whole again, her arm reattached as if nothing had happened, her blue eyes fixed on me, her smile wider than ever. I grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer, my hands shaking with rage and grief, and brought it down on her, again and again, until her porcelain body was nothing but shards, her golden curls scattered across the floor. But the hum didn't stop. It came from the pieces now, a chorus of whispers that filled the room, that filled my head, a sound that said I couldn't destroy it, that it would always come back, that it would take more, that it would never be satisfied. I dropped the hammer, my hands covered in porcelain dust, and sank to the floor, my sobs echoing in the empty house. I'd failed her. I'd failed my daughter, the only thing I had left in this world, and now she was gone, taken by something I couldn't fight, something I couldn't understand. I don't know how long I sat there, my body numb, my mind blank, but eventually I stood, my legs shaky, and went to the basement, where I'd left my old podcast equipment. I'd started a podcast after my wife died, a way to cope with the grief, but I hadn't recorded anything in months. Now, I needed to record one last message, a warning for anyone who might find a doll like Miriam, anyone who might hear the whispers, anyone who might be foolish enough to bring her into their home. I set up the microphone, my hands trembling as I pressed record, my voice raw and broken as I spoke. I told the story of what had happened, from the day I bought the doll at the garage sale to the moment I lost Abby, my words tumbling out in a rush, my tears falling onto the table as I warned whoever might be listening. I said that if they ever found a doll named Miriam with golden curls and blue eyes, they should run, that they should never bring her into their home, that she was more than a toy, that she was a vessel for something dark, something hungry, something that would take everything they loved. I stopped recording, my voice trailing off into silence, and uploaded the file to my podcast platform, setting it to publish automatically. I didn't care if anyone believed me, didn't care if they thought I was crazy. I just needed someone to know, needed someone to hear, needed someone to be warned. I turned off the equipment, the silence of the house pressing down on me, and went back to the living room, where Abby still lay on the couch, her blue eyes staring at the ceiling, her smile frozen in place. I sat beside her, my hand resting on hers, and waited for the morning, for the light to come, for the nightmare to end. But deep down, I knew it never would. It's been 3 months since I recorded that podcast episode, 3 months since I lost Abby, 3 months since I smashed Miriam into pieces. I thought it was over, thought I'd done what I could, thought I'd warned the world about the doll and the thing inside her. But I was wrong. The nightmare didn't end that night. It's only just begun. I moved out of the house in Willow Creek a week after it happened, unable to stay in a place filled with so many memories, so much pain. I sold everything I could, packed what little I had left, and moved to a small apartment in Columbus, hoping the distance would help, hoping I could start over. But the whispers followed me. They started the first night in my new place, faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the city outside my window, a low, raspy hum. The same hum I'd heard in the basement, the same hum that had come from Miriam. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was in my head, that I was imagining things, that grief and guilt were playing tricks on me. But the hum grew louder each night, more insistent, until I couldn't deny it anymore. It was coming from the box I'd brought with me, the one I'd packed in a hurry, the one I hadn't opened since I moved. I'd thought it was just old clothes, books, things I didn't need. But when I opened it, my heart stopped. There, at the bottom, was a single piece of Miriam, a shard of her porcelain face, her blue eye staring up at me, her painted smile still intact. I threw the shard out the window, watching it shatter on the pavement below, but the hum didn't stop. It followed me everywhere, a constant presence, a reminder of what I'd lost, of what I'd failed to stop. And then the podcast started getting attention. I hadn't checked it in weeks, hadn't wanted to relive that night. But one day, got an email from the platform, a notification that the episode had gone viral, that thousands of people had listened to it, that it was trending on social media. I opened the app, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the comments. Most of them were what I'd expected, people calling it a great story, a chilling tale, the best horror podcast they'd ever heard. But some were different, some were wrong. Listeners wrote that they'd heard something in the background of the episode, a low hum that wasn't part of the narration, a whisper that seemed to say their name. Others said they'd found dolls in their homes after listening, dolls they didn't remember buying, dolls with golden curls and blue eyes. One commenter said their child had started drawing pictures of a faceless man, that they could hear whispers at night, that they were scared. I deleted the episode, my hands shaking as I hit the button, but it was too late. The file had been downloaded, shared, reposted on other platforms. And the comments kept coming, more and more people saying they'd heard the hum, that they'd seen the doll, that their children were acting strange. I tried to warn them, posting messages on every platform I could, telling them to stop listening, to destroy any dolls they found to run. But the hum was everywhere now, in my apartment, in my dreams, in the voices of the people who'd listened. Last night, I heard of his voice for the first time since that night. It came from the corner of my room, where the shadows were thickest. A soft, familiar voice that said she missed me, that she wanted me to come play with her, that the big house was so much fun. I turned on the light, my heart pounding, and saw her, or what was left of her. She was standing there, her skin pale, her eyes a deep, unnatural blue, her smile wide and frozen, just like Miriam's. In her arms was the doll, whole again, her porcelain face unblemished, her blue eyes staring at me, her painted lips whispering my name. I don't know how much time I have left. The hum is louder now, the whispers constant, and I can feel it watching me, waiting for me to give in. I'm recording this epilogue as a final warning, a plea to anyone who might be listening. If you've heard the hum, if you've seen the doll, if you felt the cold, it's already too late. She knows you're listening. She knows your name, and she's coming for you. Don't listen. Don't look. Don't let her in, because once she's there, she'll never let you go.